The year 1066 is burned into English history. One twist of fate that year changed England forever during the Battle of Hastings, depicted here in the famous Bayeux tapestry. A foreign dynasty rose to rule England, but after two other twists of fate, the family came to an abrupt and catastrophic end. On the 13th of October, 1066, the Normans, led by Duke William, took up positions in these fields. The Saxon King Harold and his army appeared over the Rise. Then the battle for the future of England began. William, mounted on a white charger, ordered his Normans to attack. But they couldn't break the Saxon line. As horns sounded the Norman retreat, the Saxons made a mistake, which was to change the course of history. The Saxons broke ranks and chased the fleeing Normans. William saw his opportunity and wheeled his cavalry round, smashing into the Saxon line. It was then fate gave a helping hand. A stray arrow hit Saxon King Harold. Word spread across the field the King of England was dead. All day, Norman archers had failed to break the Saxon defense, and now one arrow had broken their resolve. The Saxon line melted away as Harold's bodyguards stayed with their dying king, but they were slaughtered to a man. A single arrow had given William the kingdom of England, but another arrow, years later, was to cripple his dynasty. Knowing a crown won in combat could easily be lost in another battle, William ruled his new kingdom with an iron fist. He was intent on crushing the Saxons and establishing a Norman dynasty to dominate England for centuries. Wherever he encountered resistance to his rule, he unleashed a whirlwind of terror. His army swept into the English heartland and destroyed everything, villages, fields, and families. With his power consolidated and his dynasty firmly rooted, William the Conqueror repaid the knights who had backed his campaigns. Saxon lords and bishops were replaced with Normans who crushed any resistance. The Normans forced the Saxons into serfdom to build monuments to William's dynasty. The old Saxon culture of wood and wattle was swept away and replaced with hard stone. Looming over the landscape, the towers were a constant reminder that England was under Norman domination. For 20 years, William the Conqueror held the kingdom in his grip. The Norman dynasty was unassailable by the time he died in 1087. He had sired two sons, William Rufus and Henry. William Rufus, the elder, took the throne. Called Rufus because of his ruddy complexion, the new Norman king was as ruthless and violent a ruler as his father. But unlike his father, he disdained the dreary details of ruling. Instead, he preferred to hunt with old friends such as Walter Tyrrell, who was destined to play a critical role in the future of the Norman dynasty. Rufus stayed in power until the year 1100, which marked the beginning of the end for a royal dynasty that seemed set to rule forever. The first year of the new century was full of ill omens. The chronicle for that year recorded that a well ran red with blood. Devils were seen in the forest. A priest had a vision of Rufus standing before the throne of God and being condemned to hell. and the Abbot of Shrewsbury preached a damning and prophetic sermon about the king.
Behold, the bow of divine wrath is drawn against the sinner, and the arrow swift to wound has been taken from the quiver. Soon now it will strike.
Never a fervent believer, the king shrugged off the omens. Instead, William Rufus took his brother Henry and his friend Walter Tyrrell to the forest for the stag hunting season. At the beginning of August, the king and his party were making their final plans for the hunt. The king had just been presented with 6 new arrows of unusual strength. William Rufus examined them and handed 2 to his friend Walter Tyrrell.
Well, Tyrrell, as you are the finest marksman, you shall have the finest arrows. Oh, make each one of them count.
That afternoon, the royal hunting party set out. As the beaters drove the deer towards the woods, the king and Tyrrell took up shooting positions and notched their arrows in readiness. Suddenly, 2 deer broke cover and ran between William Rufus and Tyrrell. In the confusion, Walter Tyrrell took aim. As the deer sped past, he turned towards the setting sun, its blinding light dazzling his eyes. He fired. His arrow missed the stag but sped on, dealing a crippling blow to the Norman dynasty. Walter Tyrrell had killed the King of England. Fearing the worst, he fled to France, never to return. After his death, William Rufus's body was taken to Winchester and buried here under the tower of the cathedral. When the tower collapsed some years later, all agreed that it was due to the ungodly body lying beneath it. And to this day, no one is sure whether King William Rufus's death was an accident or murder. Continuing the Norman dynasty, William Rufus's brother Henry took the crown. Unlike his brother, he turned out to be a just and popular ruler. But fate was plotting against him too. 20 years after taking the throne, King Henry was on the French coast, preparing to sail back to England. Traveling with the king was his son, next in line to the Norman dynasty. The weather was foul as heavy seas crashed against the coast. But on the 25th of November, 1120, the royal fleet set sail, with King Henry's ship in the lead. His son and heir was in another ship when it struck rocks in the harbor. The ship broke up and sank. The royal heir, along with the flower of noble Norman youth, drowned. The chronicle recorded,
Delicately nurtured as they were, they became food for the monsters of the deep.
King Henry, who had been celibate for 7 years since the death of his wife, tried desperately to breed a new heir. He failed and died heartbroken in 1135.
No ship ever brought so much misery to England. None was ever so notorious in the history of the world.
Thus, the male descent of the Norman dynasty passed out of succession in just 69 years, the victims not of men, but of cruel fate. While William the Conqueror fought his way to the throne of England, Catherine de' Medici was rumored to have poisoned her way to the throne of 16th century France. Her ruthless family were powerful and wealthy Italian bankers who were so intent on becoming royalty, they had the heads of the family portrayed as 3 wise men in the family chapel. The Medici's headquarters was Florence, where they had ruled for generations, but they also had connections in Rome. In 1533, Pope Clement VII, also a Medici, arranged for his niece, 14-year-old Catherine, to marry Henry, the younger son of the King of France. Shortly after Catherine de' Medici's arrival in France, Henry's older brother, the heir to the French throne, died suddenly while playing tennis. The official cause of death was a chill, but rumors circulated he had been murdered by Catherine. The Italians were notorious poisoners, and the death cleared the way for her to become Queen of France. Henry became king, but Queen Catherine bore him no children for 10 years. She then suddenly produced 6 babies in as many years. Many believed she had used witchcraft to gain fertility. Catherine was fascinated by the occult and built a special tower here at Chaumont Castle, where she consulted the famous astrologer Nostradamus. His predictions did not bode well for the Medici dynasty.
On a field of combat, he will pierce his eye in a golden cage.
Catherine's husband, King Henry II, died when a lance pierced his eye in a jousting tournament. Her oldest son, Francis, became king, but fell ill within a year.
Will die of sorrow, sad and thin.
He rapidly succumbed to an ear infection and died, leaving Catherine's second son, Charles, to succeed to the throne. But he was weak, unbalanced, and dominated by his mother.
His skin will be stained.
In 1574, the young king died in agony, sweating blood. Once again, it was rumored Catherine poisoned him to free the throne for her favorite, youngest son, Henry.
A coffin is placed in the royal vault.
Henry III was fatally stabbed by a fanatical monk in 1589.
Her children in trouble and distress.
Nostradamus's final prediction was that the French throne would pass from Medici control out of the family.
The sudden death will put another in the kingdom.
With all Catherine's sons dead, the prophecy came true, and the throne passed to the next in line, Henry of Navarre. When Catherine herself died in the same year, all seemed lost for the Medicis, but the ruthless family was not finished. The new King Henry's fiancée, Gabrielle, died mysteriously of violent stomach pains. It was rumored that she too had been poisoned. A few weeks later, Henry received an offer from the Medicis to take the wealthy Marie de' Medici as his new queen. Catherine was dead, but the Italian family revived their reputation as scheming poisoners, out to establish a royal dynasty. Marie quickly gave birth to a baby boy, who would become Louis XIII of France. For another 200 years, the Medici's descendants ruled France, until the Revolution and the guillotine put an end to monarchy there. The Medici's powerful dynasty was eclipsed by a family from the Alpine state of Austria that founded the longest royal line in European history. But in the seed of the dynasty's beginning was the germ of its eventual destruction. The obscure noble family rose to royal status to become the powerful kings of the Austrian Empire. They were the Habsburgs. A double-headed eagle was their emblem, and their motto became,
"Let others wage war, but you happy Habsburgs, marry."
While other royal families made war to gain power, the Habsburgs made love to expand their power. The dynasty was founded in 1271 in the small state of Austria. The first Habsburg kings were rulers with more ambition than power and wealth. 200 years later, the young Maximilian I was to change the entire dynasty's future. This magnificent mausoleum in Innsbruck, Austria, is laid out as a funeral procession for Maximilian. Here he is surrounded by statues of his family, relatives, and ancestors. During his rule from 1493 to 1519, Maximilian was to make the Habsburgs the most powerful royal family in Europe. But he never knew that at the same time he was sowing the seeds for their ultimate destruction. Maximilian was born in 1459. As a strong young man, he reveled in the princely arts of jousting, hand-to-hand combat, riding, and hawking. And he yearned to test his skills in war against the family enemies, the French. But his father, King Frederick III, had a plan for Maximilian's future that would strike a blow at the French and enrich the Habsburgs without firing a single shot. The Habsburgs negotiated with Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, because he had three things the Austrian royal family wanted. He was the richest man in Europe, an enemy of the French, and he had an eligible daughter, Maria. Negotiators arranged a marriage between Maximilian of Austria and Maria of Burgundy. Royal marriages of the time were political alliances rather than love matches. After diplomatic negotiations, arranged marriages had to be sealed immediately. Since the actual wedding ceremony with bride and groom had yet to take place, a ritual called a proxy marriage evolved. This required the bride to lie in bed, where she was joined by someone standing or rather lying in for the groom. To show his lusty intentions, the anonymous stand-in groom bared a leg, but to keep the bride chaste, the stand-in remained clad in full armor. But when Maria finally arrived at Maximilian's court for the wedding, the marriage was consummated in the flesh, and she soon bore a son and a daughter. And when the children, Philip and Margaret, were in turn ready for marriage, Maximilian followed the Habsburg strategy of using marriage to expand his dynasty's power. Emperor Maximilian started negotiations with the Spanish, who also had three things Austria sought: wealth, an ally against France, and two eligible royal children. The heirs to the Spanish throne were John and Joanna, the same age as Maximilian's children. Natural candidates for his power marriage strategy, Maximilian sought a double marriage to both Spanish heirs. The strategy worked, and the Spanish Joanna gave Maximilian 6 grandchildren. His grandson Charles I was to become the most powerful man in Europe, ruling over a global empire which stretched from Austria to the Netherlands, from Sicily to Mexico, and on to South America. Maximilian continued his marriage strategy and busily married his 6 grandchildren into all the major royal houses of Europe. His court became a veritable royal breeding service, and with each marriage his empire grew in power, size, and wealth. All Maximilian's granddaughters became queens. Maria was Queen of Hungary. Eleanor got France. Elizabeth got Denmark. And Catherine got Portugal. He even arranged for a daughter-in-law to marry the King of England, completing his royal flush. The Habsburg dynasty accomplished the astonishing expansion of their empire not by conquest, but by marriage. But the supply of eligible royals was running out. To hold on to their power at all costs, the Habsburgs instituted a new policy: marry within the family. The result was biological disaster. Unknown to anyone, a genetic time bomb was already planted in the Habsburg dynasty. The Spanish Joanna, whose 6 children started the marriage frenzy, eventually went insane, and her madness was hereditary. The seeds of mental illness had been transmitted to all 6 of her children, the inheritors of the Habsburg dynasty. At the same time, a physical genetic defect was emerging in the ever-expanding family, the Habsburg chin. Maximilian and many of his relatives had very pronounced lower jaws and lips. Charles I, his all-powerful grandson, had a chin which protruded so far his lower teeth could not meet his uppers. Madness and the Habsburg chin were now carried by marriage to every branch of the Habsburg dynasty and into the royal families of Europe. The genetic nightmare had begun. As Habsburg married Habsburg, inbreeding produced generation after generation of freakish mutants, many suffering from insanity. Spanish King Philip II, a depressive suffering from gout, asthma and epilepsy, decorated his bedroom with Hieronymus Bosch's nightmare paintings of hellfire and damnation. Austrian Rudolf II went insane and was forced from the crown by his brother Matthias. In Spain, the family line degenerated into the freak King Carlos. 7 of his 8 great-grandparents were Habsburgs, and his mother was also his first cousin. As a child, Carlos couldn't even stand unaided, and his jaw was so deformed he couldn't chew his food. Plagued by fainting spells and constant fevers, he was also impotent. Priests were called to exorcise this curse on the Spanish throne. But Carlos died in 1700 at the age of 39. His autopsy revealed internal organs so deformed and degenerated, witchcraft was suspected. He is remembered as Carlos the Bewitched. On his death, the crown of Spain was snatched by the old Habsburg rival, France. The genetic curse of the Habsburgs ruined Maximilian's plans and brought the Spanish line to a crashing end. But the remaining Habsburgs continued to intermarry, unaware it was the root of all their troubles. Though the Habsburg dynasty stayed in power in Austria for another 200 years, the happy Habsburgs, who had spread their dynasty all across Europe without firing a single shot, were felled by their own genes. The Habsburg dynasty lasted for 600 years, but slowly strangled itself with a disastrous policy of inbreeding. Fate cut short the Normans after just 70 years, whilst the Medici's schemes to enter the French royal bloodline finally succeeded. No matter how powerful the royal family, time was sure to humble even the most mighty of dynasties.